Let me welcome you all to our September edition of Zoom Seekers. We had a slight schedule change where Karl was originally supposed to be the October speaker, and our normal September speaker decided to get married and went on her honeymoon today. So she's going to be October, and Karl agreed to do September. So that's the way that will work. So thank you, Karl, for making that schedule change. I've known Karl for over 30 years. I first came to Catalina as the director of the hyperbaric chamber. I think it was 1992. And he had already made a name for himself in the diving and hyperbaric community because when he was at the University of Michigan, he ended up writing the programs for the Edge and the Skinny Dipper and stuff like that. So he's really one of the early adopters of dive computers and algorithms and stuff like that. But as you might imagine, not everybody gets the same background and training today. And sometimes you may be just diving with a computer and going, well, it says 3 minutes, so it must be 3 minutes. What else could it be saying? What could go wrong? And so Karl is actually here. And I overstated it a bit when I said in one of the titles, what you don't know about your computer can kill you. That was probably, he said, really, the word should be hurt you. But either way, the point is there may be things about the computers and how you use them that could work to your detriment. So we will try to take you through a bunch of stuff tonight and then give you a better idea of what you're looking at and what it says, why it says, and everything else. And at the end, we'll do a Q&A, and off we go. So, Mr. Huggins, the floor is yours as we welcome Karl with the traditional Zoom Seekers. Clap, clap, clap. Welcome. Have at it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. And let me pull up my slides here. And share. All right. Just there, hide that.
And just so you guys know, we know there will be some great things that show on the screen. We're going to try to get rid of them, but Zoom doesn't always work exactly the way we want. But Karl, that looks pretty good.
Okay. Well, like Ken said, it's not kill. It's what your dive computer doesn't know could hurt you. So what we're going to do is take a look at where did these things start? When did dive computers start coming into being? We'll look at some of the early dive decompression devices, a little very brief overview of some decompression theory. How do they work? And because they're running different models, what's the variability that we see from one computer to the other? And then what is it that the computer actually knows? And how do they know it? And then some of the things that you can do that can affect your decompression sickness susceptibility that computers have no idea about, which means that the computer isn't the only thing that you need to have to reduce your risk of decompression sickness. You have to have an understanding of your own personal situation to help with the reduction of that risk. For those of you who aren't aware, the first decompression tables actually put together for divers happened in the early 1900s with Haldane. You've probably heard that name batted about a bit during your diving years. But what he did was develop a ratio of what we call supersaturation. What amount of supersaturation could a person withstand without getting the bends? And what he found was that if you took and saturated initially goats to 2 times normal pressure and then brought them straight to the surface, they could withstand that without developing symptoms. And so basically you're looking at 1.5 atmospheres of nitrogen, which is what you get at 2 atmospheres of breathing air, 1.58 atmospheres to 1. He then took that to deeper depths, saturating goats at 5 atmospheres, bringing them up to 2.5 atmospheres to get that same ratio, and didn't show any signs in the goats. So with this, information, he developed a mathematical model. And in that mathematical model, he said the body has a wide range of tissues that can absorb and eliminate nitrogen at different rates. And from this range, we can select theoretical tissues or compartments that have different half times and use that to create a mathematical model for decompression. And all a half time is just, if you're starting here at sea level pressure and you're going to a new depth, and this would be you saturated at the new depth, then after 1/2 time, you're going to be halfway to being saturated, 2/2 times, 3/4 of the way, 3/2 times, about 87.5, and so forth. And in essence, Haldane said after 4/2 times, you're considered saturated. And
Hey,
the
Karl,
concept, yes.
you may have this coming up. Maybe you can back up a bit. Can you just tell him why it was important for Haldane to be doing this research around the turn of the century if you don't have it in an upcoming slide?
Oh, no, I don't have an upcoming slide, but he was basically hired by the British Admiralty to look at reducing the rate of decompression sickness in the Navy hard hat divers at the time. All the other decompression concepts and protocols up to that point were based on caisson workers, where people were working under pressure for most of the day and being slowly reduced in pressure up to the surface. So with this, he was able to create this mathematical model and had 5 of these compartments. And people call them tissues when they're talking about models. They are not tissues. They're a mathematical construct called a compartment. And you had fast compartments, like the 5-minute compartment here, and slow compartments, which would be the 75-minute compartment. And you just calculated nitrogen buildup in these compartments during the dive, and then how you could bring them to the surface without exceeding this ratio of 1.58 to 1 of nitrogen to ambient pressure. And so with this, he created the first set of decompression tables for the British Admiralty that were specifically designed for divers. Did some testing, had good results, sent to the Navy, and the incidence of decompression sickness dropped greatly in the Navy divers. So this is sort of where the initial concept of a decompression model of the type that we still utilize in most of the dive computers came from. So between the early 1900s and the 1950s, there were various adjustments made to this type of model. The U.S. Navy found that the faster compartments could hold more nitrogen. So the ratio of 1.58 to 1 was not the same over all the compartments, but you could hold more in the faster compartments than the slower compartments. And so in the 1930s, Navy designed a new set of tables and used that during World War II. Well, during World War II, this concept of scuba came out. And up to this point, the way decompression was handled was you had a hard hat diver that went down. The people at the surface were running the timers and had what's called a pneumo hose, which allowed you to see the depth of the diver, and ran the tables. So they winched the diver up to the first decompression stop, let him hang there for a while, and then winch him up to the next stop. So the diver was not in control of their decompression. Scuba changed all that because now you had free swimming divers, and how do you handle their decompression requirements? And so in the early 1950s at Scripps, there was a meeting looking at all sorts of aspects on this scuba diver. And just an aside, one of the concepts that came out of this meeting was the concept of the wetsuit. So up until then, you had like this yellow suit, which was a non-compensating dry suit that you wore sweaters underneath. And during those times, you had something called suit squeeze, which you generally don't hear of anymore, but was quite prevalent back then. So during this meeting, this group came up with a concept on a device that could be used to control decompression. And the description of that device was sent to a company called Foxborough. And in the early 1950s, they produced the Foxborough Decomputer Mark I and sent this to the Navy to have it evaluated. And the concept was you had a depth gauge here, and you had this disc here under this half window here. And 1/4 of the disc was green. So if there's any green showing through the window, you were safe to ascend. This quarter was red. So if any red showed through, that meant you had ascended too far and need to go back down. And the optimal decompression occurred when you just balanced these two out and just maintained the screen being white. This was supposed to simulate 2 of the compartments of the Navy's model at that time. And what happened was they found out that it did not emulate the Navy model. And the other thing was it was full of oil and it constantly leaked oil. The problem they had was it was not simulating the correct half times in the model. And so they sent it back to the company, and it was never resubmitted to the Navy to be tested again. And then the Navy went ahead and modified the Haldane model and then created their 1956 tables, which is where a lot of you probably saw the first set of tables, which were those 1956 Navy decompression and no decompression tables. But it's interesting to sort of think about if this had worked back in the early 1950s, where would we be nowadays with the technology of dive computer use in military, commercial, and recreational arenas? Because this table would never have been created. Everything would have been focused onto the dive computer concepts. So one of the things, the concept the Navy came up with in the 1950s was, once again, a Haldane type model. And this time had 6 compartments. And one of the big things that you look at when you're looking at these types of models is this is called a perfusion limited model. And the idea is that the fast tissues in the body, or in the model, the fast compartments, have a very large flow of blood to them and from them. So they can on-gas nitrogen rapidly and off-gas nitrogen rapidly. The slower ones have a very small amount of blood flow to them. The big question was, how do you handle repetitive diving? Because up until development of scuba, you just went down, you had your hard hat, you had unlimited air, did the dive, and then came up and did the decompression. Now, to get the same job done, you had to use multiple tanks. And how do you get credit for off-gassing nitrogen at the surface? So what the Navy did was they said, okay, we will sort of have a bookkeeping of what's happening in the 120-minute compartment of the model. And that's going to show you what your penalty is going into a repetitive dive. So if you look at the tables, when you're actually calculating on the tables what your repetitive penalty is, you're completely ignoring what's happening in these 5 compartments, which is fine because this one is slow enough to be conservative enough to handle those problems. But if you did this repetitive dive within 10 minutes, it wouldn't be the case, which is why you have to have a surface interval of at least 10 minutes on the Navy tables to consider it a new dive. So just because the Navy stopped working on it didn't mean that other companies and other concepts came about for a diver carried decompression device or a decompression meter. This was a SOS decompression meter. Basically, as long as the needle was here in the surface, you could come to the surface. If it was in the 10-foot range, you had to come up to 10 feet and wait for the needle to drop below. And I can't see any of you, but any of you know what this was also called? Ken, can you see if anybody raised their hands who knows what it was called?
Hang on, I have to look because I'm not looking at everybody either. Hold on. I have the gallery. Susie Horowitz has her hand up. Anyone else? Tabby's got his hand up.
Tabby would know.
Tabby probably used one. But we'll let Tabby has inside information. Susie, would you like to tell everybody what the nickname is? And you have to unmute yourself to do it.
I believe it was called the Bendomatic.
That's right, the Bendomatic. There are many people who use these things and push them to the limits who ended up with some serious decompression sickness. We had a case back in Michigan where the diver did like 3 repetitive dives to 150 feet and said everything was fine on his meter. And when it was tested, it never went into decompression at 150 feet. So there's definitely something wrong with this. But on the other side of the coin, there were commercial diving companies that did utilize these, especially for oil rig work where they went down and worked themselves up. They maintained the calibration and they had good experience with it. They had thousands of dives on these things without any problems. So these were pneumatic devices. They basically simulated the body absorption and elimination of nitrogen by a little ceramic resistor between a regular gauge and a little plastic bag. And as you went down, the bag squeezed down and forced air into the gauge. When you came up, the air came out of the gauge into the little bag. So that was sort of one of the first concepts of how to handle a decompression device. A little bit more sophisticated was the same sort of pneumatic device that was developed by DCIM, or Defense and Civil Institute for Environmental Medicine in Canada. And this had 4 of these pneumatic resistors that then were linked together. And if you look at the face here, you had this big gauge being your depth, and then this little needle here would move down as you accumulated nitrogen in the gauges here. And eventually, if it crosses 0, that means you're now on a decompression dive. This device, to this day, has the most human subject tests done on them for any diver carried decompression device ever. And actually, the design of this was used to create the mathematical model for the Canadian tables and not vice versa. So first they developed the device, they tested the device, then they created the mathematics of the device to create a model. And just remember this, because we're going to be talking about this in a little while.
And Karl, if I can interject for just a moment, Tabby sent me a note, says he's never used a benzomatic, but he does have one that someone gave him, just to clear that up.
And my favorite one is the one that Dan Orr has, which is basically he took the guts out, filled it up with lead, and doesn't have any problems with it. Now, if we get into more modern technology, the first microprocessor-based diver carried decompression device also came out of DCIM, which is called the XDC3 or Cyber Diver. And it was developed a few years ahead of its time because it didn't have low power circuitry. And so this device could run continuously for 4 hours with 4 9-volt batteries. you could then maintain your dive history by changing the batteries on the fly, and you wouldn't lose your information. But still, think about taking this for a week-long dive trip where you would have to change the 4 9-volt batteries every 4 hours. And that is not very effective. So basically, our dive computer revolution started in the early 1980s. And 2 dive computers, the Edge, which is the one I worked on back in Pennsylvania, and the DecoBrain, which was out of Liechtenstein. Initially, it was reading 5 sets of Swiss tables. They then went to plugging the Swiss model into it, found that you can't just take the pure model that was tested with tables and do that, because they had a bunch of bends show up, and then they had to go and modify the model and make some adjustments. But since 1983, and I'm just realizing that's how many years ago? That's 40 years ago.
Many years ago.
40 years ago. And this is not the most current slide that I've done, but this is basically 1 year that I just took all the models that were available that year and put them into a slide. And if you have this for all these years, there are hundreds and hundreds of different types of dive computers out there. They're running different models. And so if you took all of these together on the same dive, you are not going to have the same result. Not only do you have those types of dive computers, but you've got others. You could actually make your phone into a dive computer where you put it in a case that has a pressure transducer that links to your phone via Bluetooth. You have your watches like the, what's this? I can never remember. The Apple Watch, that you can actually rent a decompression algorithm for a month if you don't want to buy a dive computer. But there are all sorts of other devices out there that will give you decompression information. There are apps for your phones. There are programs for your computer that allow you to run scenarios. If you're going to do a dive, say a trimix dive, you can plug in all the factors and run the calculations for a dive. And so this is showing you a 200-foot dive for 26 minutes at depth. And so you leave it 30 minutes, and here are your stops coming up. And so it's going to take you almost an hour to ascend from this dive. There are software packages like this Subsurface where you can plug in a profile and see what your loading is in your compartments. And so you can plan dives that way. They are all, in essence, dive computers. They're running a decompression algorithm that is giving you a result showing you how close you are from the limits of an underlying model that's programmed into it. So that brings us up to, what is a dive computer? And you need to ask yourself, what is it? How do I use it? What do I use it for? And the main thing you have to understand, it is just a tool. It's just another piece of equipment that's giving you information about the dive that you need to take in and understand that, number one, it has no idea what is happening in your body. It's just running a decompression model based upon the profile that you have been doing. How do they work? Basically, they sense depth and time, and some put in other variables. They then calculate your decompression status from a pre-programmed model. That status is displayed to the diver. And then where it falls apart is the diver uses the status as another piece of information to make decisions about the dive while understanding the limitations of the dive computer. And that's the big thing. People do not understand there are limitations to the dive computer, and they need to know what those limitations are. One of the main limitations are all they generally understand is depth and time, and there's a lot of different other factors that can influence decompression sickness susceptibility. They have a timer that feeds time into the microprocessor, pressure transducer, which feeds in depth. Interesting thing of note is that you have to adjust the pressure transducer based on the temperature. So you have a temperature sensor in here. And just because you have a temperature sensor, now we can actually display the temperature of the dive computer, which after it equilibrates with the water is water temperature. But that's the only reason to have temperature in your display, is because you need the temperature there to adjust the transducer. So you've got your calculations being done, and then you display the information to the diver. You can have them hooked up to your tank so that they can monitor your tank pressure, calculate based on your breathing rate how much more time you have in your tank before you hit 500 psi or whatever you set it to. Some of them will actually adjust the decompression calculations based upon how rapid the tank pressure drop is. So it's sensing a very rapid drop. It might assume that you are working hard and make your model more conservative. Some can actually hook up to cardiac monitors, and as your heart rate goes up, it'll say you're working hard, and I'll make the model more conservative and make adjustments that way. But those are relatively few in terms of the number of dive computers out there that take into effect any way you might think of in terms of determining how rapid your heart rate is or how much you're working. So what's the benefit with the computers? So we're looking at things like Haldane had a theory of how this works. From this theory, he created a mathematical model. Both of these are very flexible, but once you take this information and put it into a table, it becomes very rigid. And so if you looked at the Navy tables, then just in the no decompression table, you've only got about 140 depth time combinations available to you. You can do whatever dive you want, but you've got to pigeonhole it into one of these entries. Whereas a dive computer that's able to resolve half a foot of seawater difference and updates its status every 3 seconds, then in a 10-foot depth range over 1 minute, it can discern 400 different square wave profiles. And then if you start going and looking at multi-level bouncing up and down, you're dealing with 20 to the 20th profiles. So it's a lot of profiles that can resolve. The computers are still dealing with discrete depth and time increments, but they are much smaller than you would see in a set of tables. So you get this information, the depth and the time, and then the calculations are done by the computer from the inputs. You are allowing the model to keep track as to where you are and the profile, and not just assuming you're spending the entire time at your maximum depth. But what is used to calculate the status? And that is the decompression algorithm. And there's many, many different types of decompression algorithms, and they all will not give you the same response to the same dive profile. There are different configurations. You've got a Haldanian configuration where you have your compartments that are exposed to the outside nitrogen pressure or ambient pressure. You have a tissue slab model, which allows gas to flow in and out of a slab. None of the dive computers use this model. But then you have some where you're going in the serial mode, where you go from outside pressure to first compartment, second compartment, and so forth, moving in and out. This is what the Canadian model is. And then you have some of these newer models, which are called two-phase or bubble models, that assume that there's some gas phase inside the compartment and calculate your status based on that. So these are the different types of models that are being used in most of the dive computers out there. And so what happens is you've got the compartments of the model and registers in the dive computer. You look at what the pressure is. You calculate the new pressure in these compartments. You compare them to the maximum amount of nitrogen allowed in that compartment at the surface. And then you ask it asks, how long at this depth will it take me to reach this time? And so calculates a no decompression time for each compartment, displays the shortest one, and then starts all over again. And that's all they do. Every few seconds, they do these calculations and update your no D time. So if you were to take a dive computer and program in the old US Navy table or old US Navy model, if you took the table, the old Navy table, and asked how long can I spend at 80 feet and not go into decompression, the no D limit for 80 feet is 40 minutes. So if you were to take your dive computer down to 80 feet and spend all the time at 80 feet and look at it at 35 minutes in, it would give you approximately 5 minutes because you're doing the dive profile that the tables assume. However, if you did this profile here, bounced up and down, hit 80 feet a couple times, if that happened with tables, you have to assume your whole time was spent at 80. But if you look at the dive computer here, you think you have more time? Anyone?
Carl, they're all muted.
Okay.
So that,
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
except for Glenn, who unmuted himself.
Okay, Glenn, how much more time do you think you'd have?
Way to go, Glenn. Now you're on the spot. Now you have to answer.
Maybe about almost half, it looks like.
I think Glenn, what he wants to do is how much more time would you have? In other words, what would your number, how much no decompression time on a multi-level profile would you have at that point at the top of the red line on a dive computer? It's 5 minutes on the tables. How much on a dive computer?
Or a dive computer that went down and spent the entire time here?
Yes. So it would be essentially the difference between the white and the green, and it looks to be twice as long, maybe.
Okay, so actually you end up with 130 minutes more. So it comes up to be 135 minutes because you've accumulated less nitrogen in the model than you're assuming with a square wave dive. Plus you're asking how long can I stay at about 45 feet instead of 80 feet. So this is the big advantage on dive computers. You're not limited by this maximum depth entire bottom time rule. And it's calculating the status of the entire model during this and not just looking at results on a table.
And Carl, maybe visually, can you go back to that for 1 second?
Mhm.
Maybe visually, and sort of what Glenn was saying. If you were diving it on a square profile, the dive tables would penalize you, if you will, for everything that's green and white because it's a square profile, whereas the dive computer is only tracking the green portion. So
So only tracking the white portion,
okay.
and
But
it's not taking into account any green portion here.
Oh, right. I had it backwards. Yeah. But in other words, it's not giving you all of that stuff because it's computing exactly where you are.
Right. So in terms of advantages and disadvantages, the big advantage is this no maximum depth entire bottom time rule. Disadvantage is you no longer have this maximum depth entire bottom time rule, because what that did is that gave you a safety buffer. So you've thrown out that table safety buffer. Also, it'll actually use the depth you're at. You won't have to round up to the next deeper depth. But at the same time, that adds conservatism to table use. So you're getting rid of some of these things that make tables safer. You integrate the entire dive profile, but by integrating it, you can push your computer closer to the limits of the actual model, whereas the table, you're not getting as close to the limits of the model by utilizing the table. You are using the entire model to calculate your status, not just the one compartment that the tables utilize for repetitive dives. And like I said, if you push the computer to the limit, you're pushing the model to the limit. And you have to ask yourself how much testing has been done to validate that model. And unfortunately, there has not been much testing done to validate models and dive computers in multi-level type diving situations. So like I said, the greatest test base was the Canadian one with almost 4,000 person dives. Edge, we had about 119 person dives to check for hotspots. Those are the two most, the two devices that had the most testing in it for basically multi-level diving dive computer tests. All the others are taking and saying, oh, we dove this thing. Nobody had any problems, so it must be safe. So just understand, if you push these things to the limits, you could be doing human subject tests on yourselves. Computers have good computational reliability, but there's also the possibility of mechanical or electrical failure. You've got good, accurate depth readings, descent rate warnings, and from our perspective, looking at somebody coming in, the ability to get dive profiles off of them is great because it allows us to make decisions about treatments. At the same time, the diver needs to understand the limitations of the dive computer, and it's always a possible crutch. If your dive computer went down and you're on a 2-week vacation diving, are you able to get back in and pull up a set of tables and dive with those? What are you going to do? So in terms of talking about going to the limit, one of the things that the computers will have is graphical representation of how close you are to the limits of the model. And there are various things like the edge, getting close to the line here, the various pelagic ones that have the green, yellow, red. And if you get in past the yellow, you're in violation of the underlying model. Shear waters, which give a little graph showing this orange area here, you're super saturated, but you're below the maximum amount that's allowed. Things like that, whether you're on gassing, whether you're off gassing, and so forth, gives you information to let you know how close you are to the limits of the model. Same thing with some of the programs. I had a little heat map that shows that these compartments here are red, so that means they are in excess of what's allowed, and then eventually we'll get yellower and yellower as they off gas. So looking at dive computers and how they respond to the same profiles, we work with Scuba Diving Magazine on their dive computer tests, and we will run various computers on the profiles they want, and sometimes we get to keep them and run them against profiles we want to look at. And one of the profiles that we look at is from the PADI recreational dive planner tests, where they sent people down to 130 feet, came up to 70 feet, then up to 45 feet. Overall dive time, a little over 55 minutes. They had 19 people do this dive, no cases of decompression sickness. They had 2 cases of very low Doppler bubbling, where you can actually hear bubbles that were produced, but no outward signs of decompression sickness. So it's a relatively low stress profile. And we look at the computers, what they say a minute before each ascent here. And this is looking at a culmination of a lot of different tests. And we can see that there are some computers that at the end of that 130-foot depth are giving about a minute or two remaining, whereas there are some computers that have up to 7 minutes of required decompression at that point. So we come up to 70 feet, and we're getting ready to ascend to 45. And we can see at the end of that 70-foot stop, you've got the dive computer here that gives you 13 minutes of remaining no decompression time. You got this one here that says you require 9 minutes of decompression. And then at the end of the 45-foot stop, we have anywhere from 15 minutes of required decompression all the way up to 26 minutes of remaining no decompression. So the question is, which one is correct? And the answer is based on the model they're using, calculations they're doing, they are all correct according to their model.
So the answer is yes.
Yes.
Which one is correct? The answer is yes. And if that doesn't confuse you, that's why Karl is giving this talk.
The answer is they all are based upon the internal calculations and models they've been programmed with. So it's a mild profile. So is, 10 to 15 minutes of required decompression a little bit of overkill? Yeah. But at the same time, I'd rather have a little bit more safety margin there than if we went out 26 minutes, we have no idea what additional risk is incurred. It may be very mild. It may be not at all, or you may end up with a serious hit. We don't have the data. And then this one is looking at how you can change various things to make the computers more conservative. So we did have 3 shearwater computers on the last testing that was done here, plus the shearwater we have for our operations. There are these things called gradient factors, which you can adjust to make the model more conservative. And so all a gradient factor is ignore this right now. That's a low factor. The high factor is the one you're dealing with in no decompression dives. So this computer is set so that it will require you to be at 95% or less of what the model allows when you hit the surface. Least conservative setting would be 100. So here you're giving yourself a 5% buffer. And this is using Perdix 2 set at 45, 95, and at this point here, leaving 60 feet on this 4th dive of the day, you have 37 minutes remaining. If you look at the Petrel, another shearwater computer, also set at 45, 95, we show 36 minutes. So in essence, they're running the same model, the same conservatism, and coming up pretty close to the same answer. So if you take and do Predict AI, which is the one we have at our chamber, where we set it at 70%, this means we have to drop the compartments down to 70% of their maximum before we surface. We only have 20 minutes remaining. And then Shearwater has just been able to put in the Canadian model, the DCIM model. And so we ran one with that model going. And remember I said DCIM model most extensively tested model out there. It gave us 13 minutes. So it's a very conservative model, and it has a lot of testing associated with it. But these are same company, same base model in 3 of them, Canadian model in the 4th, but the only difference in the first 3 is that you've got one that is set at a lower gradient factor and making it more conservative. So you've got these variations that can exist that you can plug in conservatism to make even more difference. What does that do in terms of your decompression safety? Depth and time are just one aspect of your decompression safety. So by making it more conservative, yes, you're making your decompression status safer. But there are all sorts of other factors can come into play in terms of making your risk change depending upon the day, depending on what your body composition is, depending on your exertion level. There are a lot of things that can impact that. And so if we look at what the computers understand versus other factors that impact your susceptibility, you can see that all the dive computers are looking at depth and time. Some of them will plug in ascent rate. So if you're going up too fast, will make your model more conservative. Others will take temperature and make your model more conservative. Problem with that is you can be physiologically colder in 80-degree water in the skin suit versus full dry suit in the Arctic. So all it understands is temperature of the dive computer. If you're doing a lot of bouncing up and down, some computers will look at your sequence and say, this is risky activity. We're going to make your computer more conservative. Breathing mixtures, it doesn't know what you're breathing unless you tell it what mix you're breathing. Exertion level, like I said, there are some that will take in your tank pressure drop or hooks up the cardiac monitor, looks at your heart rate. And if it feels that you're exerting yourself more, will make your model more conservative. And there's actually one out there that you put in your birth date. And as you get older, your no decompression times will drop. Other things like physical conditioning, limb positioning, hydration level, whether you've got a PFO or not, body composition, the dive computer knows nothing about. So these are things that you have to bring to the table in terms of your understanding as to what your potential susceptibility would be that day. So you need to have at least 2 computers, with one of them being a thought process and your own personal understanding of yourself at that point in time. Looking at some of the things that can impact you, hydration. There's a nice study that looked at people who basically drank Gatorade 90 minutes before a dive. And those people who didn't drink generally had higher bubble grades than those people that did hydrate themselves. So hydration is important.
You want to tell them quickly, Karl, what a bubble grade is, please?
Bubble grade is in monitoring people for decompression stress. We can actually listen to bubbles going through their heart or through their veins. And we do a way of counting it, and you can get a bubble score in terms of numbers or grade. And the higher the grade, the higher the potential stress and the higher the risk.
And these are bubbles that right now would be asymptomatic. They're not causing a problem, but in theory, they could down the road present a problem.
not necessarily down the road, but it's an indication of stress because a lot of these bubbles are being washed out by the lungs. But the more you have means the more sites there are in your body that are generating these bubbles that once they get in the bloodstream, they're pretty much going to get washed out. But where they're being generated, there might be a problem in those areas.
Carl, I noticed that the test was 90 minutes before a dive. Does that kind of counter the idea that you drink, a lot of fluid right before you enter the water?
Well, the concept is you've got to get that fluid into your tissues. So it takes a while to absorb fluid into your body and get that volume into your bloodstream. So that's why they have 90 minutes before a dive. And it says they started 90 minutes before the dive. How long they took, I don't think was indicated here. But it wasn't that they gulped down 1.3 liters immediately 90 minutes before the dive, but they started drinking before the dive. So yeah, if you swig lots of water right before going on a dive, it's going to take most of that dive for that fluid to actually get absorbed into your bloodstream. And what you're looking at is trying to maintain enough flow in your blood so that when you're off gassing, you can actually get that blood flow from the tissue to the blood and to the lungs. Another big one is temperature, and the U.S. Navy did a very nice study where all the dives utilized this decompression schedule, which was the 120 for 70-minute schedule, 9 minutes at 30 feet, 23 minutes at 20, 55 at 10. So every single one of these schedules, every single one of these dives followed this schedule. And they were looking at divers being warm at the bottom or warm during decompression, cold at the bottom, cold during decompression, or the other combinations, warm at depth, cold during decompression, cold at depth, warm during decompression. Now, what they found with people being warm at depth and during decompression, if you ran this table at 70 minutes and you ran it straight from the Navy tables, you ended up with about 16-17% incidence of decompression sickness. So they then looked at people who were cold at depth and cold during decompression. And because the Navy says if you're cold, you go to the next greater time. So what they did was back off to 60 minutes and ran the test there and ended up with about 22% incidence of decompression sickness. Well, one of the problems they had was on a salvage where they were doing deep dives. Well, not that deep, but like 120 feet, and had hot water suits at depth and then decompressing in a cold chamber. They saw a lot of hits. So they dropped the 60 minutes down to 30 minutes, had people warm at depth, cold during decompression, and ended up with about the same incidence of decompression sickness, but at 30 minutes. So half this time, you still had the same incidence of decompression sickness depending on the temperature. So what's happening is at depth, you're warm and you're allowing the blood to move freely through your extremities, and it has a greater chance of being absorbed by the tissues. Now, if you get cold on decompression, you're shutting down blood flow, and so you're not getting rid of that nitrogen as fast. They dropped down to a 25-minute dive, same schedule, warm at the bottom, cold during decompression, and ended up with 5% incidence of decompression sickness. They then switched it where they were cold at depth and warm during decompression. At 30 minutes, no incidence. 50 minutes, no incidence. And finally, all the way at 70 minutes, they actually ended up with about 1.5% incidence of decompression sickness. So if you're cool or colder at depth, you're restricting the blood flow and not absorbing as much. And then when you're on your decompression, if you warm up, that's going to open up the blood flow and allow whatever gas has been accumulated to be washed out faster. So temperature has a very great impact on decompression sickness susceptibility. And none of this is incorporated in the dive computers that we utilize. How about exercise at depth? Well, if you're exercising at depth, you're allowing more blood flow to get to those muscles and have a greater chance of that gas getting trapped in there during decompression if you stop your exercise. So this looked at 100 feet for 60 minutes, and using a 40-minute schedule, they had no incidence of decompression sickness when there was no exertion. With light exertion, they had to more than double the decompression to get the same results. At moderate workload, they're up here at about 2 hours compared to the initial 40 minutes to have that same incidence. And then under heavy exertion, they actually canceled the study because one person ended up with very serious decompression sickness. So if you're working hard at depth, that's going to make you more susceptible to decompression sickness. How about mild exercise during decompression? Well, conversely, if you come up, what do you do at your safety stop? Do you just stop and do nothing? Well, what you want to do is you want to move your limbs, move around, mild exertion to keep the blood flowing to those areas. And they showed that on study where there was like almost 150 feet for a half hour, 55 minutes of decompression. Those who were inactive during the time had more bubbles than those people who were active. And this is just minutes after decompression. And you can see that those that were active had less bubbling on all of those recordings. Looking more at what recreational divers would do, 100 feet for 30 minutes, followed by 3 minutes at 10 feet. And those people who did exertion or did some moderate exercise had lower bubbles than those people who didn't. And when they did a flex or a cough to dislodge more bubbles, it was much more significant where the bubbles were lower than they were for the people who didn't do any moderate exertion during the decompression phase. Okay, how about vibrations? What does vibrations have to do anything about? Well, there's a study looking at people who were put on a vibrating platform prior to a dive. So, pardon me. They were put on this platform, they went on a dive, and they were compared their bubbles on that versus their control bubbles. So everybody went on the dive without any intervention of oxygen or vibration plus oxygen. And they found there was a very dramatic drop in those people who had been exposed to vibration. Those people who had breathed oxygen prior to the dive had a small reduction. But if you put the two of them together, you didn't have an additive effect. It was somewhere in between. So this is where decompression study is still ongoing. Why is that? We don't know. All we know is that we got a result with vibration, got a result with oxygen, but putting the two together didn't have an additional impact. And some of the concepts here is you might have little micronuclei, these little bubbles that your body generates just by movement stuck to the edge of your blood vessels. And by vibrating it, you knock them loose and they go and get washed out by the lungs. But it's still one of those things being studied. The other one is heat stress. There's a study looking at a sauna prior to the dive, and those people who had the sauna had a lower bubble grade. So why is that? Are heat stress proteins or other things conditioning the lining of the blood vessels? We don't know why, but various things like that can impact your decompression sickness susceptibility. But the important one is chocolate. Does chocolate consumption prior to diving help with your decompression status? Does it help reduce your risk? Unfortunately not. So here's the control. Here's vibration. Here's sauna. Here's chocolate. No significance between the control and the chocolate consumption. So that would have been a wonderful result if it helped, but it didn't. There's no difference. So some of the things you have to realize is that these mathematical models inside the computer do not tell you what is going on inside your body. Dive computer or table is going to look at things like, okay, in this area here, I'm fine. Get to this line here, cross over it. Oh, you're in violation. So it's black or white. Yes, you're okay. No, you're not okay. In reality, just like most things, there's a dose response curve. So our increasing dose of depth time, as we increase, we're going to eventually start getting people showing decompression sickness symptoms until you get so much of a dose that everybody ends up with decompression sickness. So it's a gradual increase of risk as you go on and increase the dose. So if we look at it from the perspective of the dive computer, which is the blue line here, and what your probable response is, this is red is the average, and that there are people on either side of that, the people who are less susceptible, people who are more susceptible, that this is probably what reality looks like. The thing we don't know is where on this curve the differences in the dive computer's response lie. So here's the dose allowed by the various dive computers. Where do they actually fall? What are the bounds? And we don't know. I mean, we can probably just go and say, okay, if this is where the variation falls, where the most conservative will never produce decompression sickness or decompression stress, and the least will probably produce a very small risk, we probably wouldn't see any incidence of decompression sickness at all. And if it was here where you had the more conservative side seeing a slight risk and the higher end showing a very high risk, we'd probably see more cases of decompression sickness. So what it probably is somewhere in the middle, but we don't know what the top here versus the bottom here have in terms of their relative risk, whether it's significant or not significant. So need to just realize that dive computers are only tools. There's hundreds of these out there with various decompression algorithms in it. There are very limited human subject tests. You can adjust the algorithm to make it more conservative. So what it means is most people are looking at the dive computer, looking at the features they would like to have because they can always make the model more conservative. But no matter what advertising says, the computer does not know what's going on inside your body. And for treatments, they can provide very valuable post-dive information. Activities to think about. safety stops, do them. It's going to increase gas washout before surfacing. Deep stops, if you're going from a deep depth all the way up to the surface, yeah, take about 30 seconds halfway in between. In essence, is like slowing down your ascent, but it's going to help wash out the fast tissues in your body, and some of the bubble models say it's going to reduce bubble growth. But if you do that and you're using tables, include that time in your bottom time. If you're using the computers will take that into account. Hydration, you want to hydrate before and after the dive to maintain that blood flow so you can wash out the gas after the dive. Heavy exertion before the dive, you can create these little micro bubbles or seeds inside your body and make you more susceptible for decompression sickness. During the dive, it increases your gas wash up or gas uptake. And then after the dive, it's like throwing salt into soda. If you do that and create little micro bubbles by working too hard or exerting yourself too much after a dive, you can actually seed bubbles from the gas that's currently accumulated in your body. Mild activity, you want to maintain that during your safety and decompression stops to help with gas washout. Avoid holding on to things tightly, because if you hold on to things tightly or bend your limbs, you're blocking blood flow from those areas and increasing the risk of bubble formation. And I know a lot of people like to lay down or take a nap after a dive, but if you think about it, you're still off-gassing. You're on your final decompression stop, which is the surface. If you do this now, you're dropping your metabolic rate down. You're slowing down your off-gassing if you do that. So just maintain light to moderate activity, moving around to keep that gas washout going after a dive. Acknowledge that there's risks involved. Understand the limitations of the computers and the tables. Don't push them to limits. Add safety factors when you can. Don't think of dive computers as anti-decompression sickness talisman. They do not ward away bubbles. They do not suck nitrogen from your body. And just basically use common sense. So, questions?
Oh, I'm sure we'll have some questions. Let me stop your share.
Okay.
Let me get everybody back so we can see everybody. And we do the thank you very much, Karl. So with questions, guys, as we either physically raise your hand or use the little hand raise icon, I'll get the first question. So it sounds, Karl, that what you're suggesting post-dive, since you don't want us to lay down or take a nap, probably the best thing to do is if we could suspend ourselves by our heels from the yard arm and do mild exercise until we go in the water the next time, that would work out. I'm going to make you answer that.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Andrea's got her hand up. She's got her digital hand up, so we'll go with her first. You got to unmute, Andrea. There we go.
Okay. The thing I've noticed, Karl, is when I'm diving with people who have different computers than I do, I use Sunto, like the Novo. On the first dive, we're frequently very close in terms of no decompression time. But on subsequent dives, there tends to be much greater variability, and that increases with every subsequent dive. Can you talk a little bit about why those differences occur? Is it just differences in the algorithm, or how does that work?
So it would be, if you noticed in the dive computer results we showed earlier, that the Suntos tended to be more conservative than the others. And so are you saying that the Sunto no-D remaining times were close to the other no-D remaining times, or did you dive and you tend to be able to dive the same dive and come up even though?
what I'm saying is on dive 1, the times are very similar between the Sunto and the other computers. It's on dives 2 and 3 where the no decompression time starts to be significantly different between the Sunto and the other computers.
A lot of that is going to.
Real quick, are these, Andrew, are these two computers that you have, or you and a buddy?
Me and a buddy. No,
Okay.
I dived when I dive now. Well, in the past I've had an Oceanic and a Sunto, and there's been a huge difference.
Right.
But now I always dive the same computer. I always have redundancy on in a resort dive.
Okay.
But it's, my buddies have Shearwater, they have Oceanic, different computers that they're using.
Yeah, and it's going to depend upon the depths of the dive, the lengths of the dive, because there are some switchovers in the model where one model may be less conservative at a certain depth range than the other, but they may be relatively equal for other depth ranges. And so that you may be seeing that type of situation for the first dive. Once you get past the first dive, now you're going to be having more of the model impacting repetitive dives rather than just like a single compartment on an initial dive. There are others, there are some that you can see the difference because the off-gassing is going to be different. Some use symmetrical on-gassing and off-gassing. Others have slower off-gassing than on-gassing. And so you're holding on to the nitrogen longer in the model. So depending on how it's programmed, you can have those differences. Yeah.
And Karl, with that example, with your buddy, how much of a difference would it make? You're here and your buddy's 10 feet higher or 10 feet lower. How much of a difference might that make in the
It depends. It depends on what depth you're at. Because there are some, if you're one compartment's fine here and not going to be impacted and not be able to go into decompression at this depth, but another computer is down here, even within a foot or so, you could have a major difference in the results on the same dive computer, just moving from one to another. And if you're diving with a buddy, they're doing a different dive profile than you. And unless you're pretty much synced up, you'll start to see some deviation between each other, especially if one of the people tends to be deeper than the other.
Okay. Any other question? I'm looking at my backup computer, see if I see any hands raised. Glenn's got a brave hand being raised. Go ahead, Glenn.
Are there any other computers besides the Shearwood, I guess you mentioned, or that have the Canadian model, so to speak?
So the Shearwater at this time is the one that's been licensed to put the Canadian model into it, primarily because the Canadian tables are the ones that are approved for military and commercial use in Canada. And so by having that gives them the ability to have that model be utilized in their work up there. There had been a couple other attempts at putting the Canadian model in computers that never really got off the ground too much. Like the Cyber Aqualung watch had it in there. And if you notice that on one of the results, the Cyber Aqualung watch at the 60-foot stop gave much more required decompression than any of the other ones. But yeah, this one, I'm actually looking at getting that. It's just a hardware fix. Basically, you get a code and you can activate in any of the newer Shearwater ones, you can activate that model. And since we run Canadian tables here at our facility, because they are conservative, that's one of the things we're looking at. Putting in, I think it's like $300 to kick in that model. Yeah.
And I'll remind you that, coming up with the next Chamber Day fundraiser, you can contribute that $300 to allow Karl to buy that extra model. Would be just fine. Katie has her hand up. Katie, you got the floor. Once you unmute.
That's what I was trying to figure out. Yeah, this is kind of more of an academic question, at least from my perspective, but I was reading the latest issue of the Dan magazine, and they've got this article about this guy, Oscar Franberg, and it was talking about a new model they're validating in Sweden, and I was just wondering if you'd read that article, if you'd heard of this, and what you thought about that model and their testing of it. It seemed like they had a really, really cool dive testing facility that they've built for experimentation.
So are they doing any of this stuff at, is it all dry, or is it the Nemo 30?
It seems they have a place where a thing they've built that goes down like 500 feet that they can use for testing, like a very deep pool.
It sounds like it's probably like the Swedish Navy. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And that's been the issue, is that for the recreational side of things, there just haven't been enough funding to do that. And don't mind me, I'm looking through my latest Dan magazine to see if I can find it. And here we go. So I'll have to read that and see what they're doing, because the Swedish Navy basically has used the U.S. Navy tables or some variant of it for many, many years. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. And it looks like, just glancing at it, that they're developing a new table, and whether or not that's going to be tested as an algorithm or a model as opposed to a table is one of the big things to be aware of. If they do it where they run a dive computer with the person being tested, and you're trying to push that computer to its limit at different depths, then that can be a way of validating the model. Like the Canadian model is actually hooked up to chambers. That was it wasn't a model, it was the device was hooked up to chambers, and any dive operations being done in the chamber had to follow to the letter the results from that device. And that's how they helped with the validation of that device.
Yeah, I think they're focused on tables, not computers at this point.
Yeah. But no, it'll be interesting to see what they come up with.
Okay. I was just curious. It just happened the two topics came up close together for me. So the other thing is, I guess, just on a very practical note, it sounds like diving and being slightly cold on the dive and then getting out into a very warm environment is actually a pretty good situation for off-gassing.
Yeah, you'd want to, basically the studies they were looking at were warm in the water during the final depth. So basically when they were 30 foot and shallower in the study, they were warm. So this is where thermoclines are your friend, because you're going from cooler to warmer. Or if any of you are getting into dry suit diving with the active heating in it, is that you don't turn this on until you get done with your dive and start decompressing, to stay warm during your decompression and slightly chilled during your actual dive.
And then the other thing I got out of this was when you have those safety stops where you're just cruising around the reef looking at stuff for your whole safety stop, that's actually a really good way to do a safety stop.
Yeah, and not only with kicking, but moving your arms as well. So if you are a photographer, get yourself a little a lanyard or something that you can let it dangle down, because if you're swimming around holding on tightly to it, then that's going to prevent blood flow in your arm and hand.
Cool. Thank you. Good talk. Very much
Carl,
enjoyed it.
I think you'll have to pry my camera out of my cold bent hand. Oh, look, I'm suffering nitrogen narcosis right now.
Yeah, you're all fuzzy.
I'm all fuzzy. Well, maybe no. You're seeing me as all fuzzy. Maybe you're the one who's bent or narked.
Yeah.
Quick question for you on
That just shows how unfocused you are.
yes, well, that's true. We all know that. Just a quick question on people who dive with, I don't know why my camera's not picking up on this, but it isn't.
Too much shine on your forehead.
Yeah, too much forehead for my shine. People who are diving with two different computers, sort of, there we go. As Andrea mentioned, what I always advise people of, you need to know which is the more conservative of your computers, and that needs to be your primary computer, because even
Right.
though it's rare that computers go down underwater, if your computer goes down, you don't want to whip out your backup and suddenly realize you violated it yesterday and you're in a lockout mode.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, you just want to go with correct. You don't want to amplify on that.
Oh, yes, that is a very good idea.
All right, fine, thank you. Anyone else have questions? Hands. Glenn's got his hand up again. Oh, wait a minute. Andrea's got her hand up too. We'll go Glenn, then we'll go Andrea.
Okay. So the things that the dive computer doesn't address, you mentioned vibration platform. I have one at home, and sauna before dives. I could just imagine both of those happening on a liveaboard dive trip. That might be interesting. But vibration platform, the reason why I got it is because it's exercise without a lot of movement. It's moving your muscles essentially, very, very short, and saunas also putting stress on your body as well before a dive. Should that be?
You don't, these are some interesting studies that are out there. I wouldn't necessarily, now, one of the benefits of going on a bumpy boat ride out to a dive site, maybe that might be helping you due to vibrations. But yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done to say why this is showing up like this. One of the theories is that the endothelial lining, or the lining of the blood vessels, can hold these little micronuclei that can form seeds for bubbles. And that by conditioning them, either by like heat stress proteins or actually some, forgetting the other studies where they were actually just doing exercise prior to the exposures, and actually there's, what's the active ingredient in Viagra that's
If you're asking me, I don't know why you think I would know that, and I don't, and I'm very insulted.
I'm not asking you specifically. Anyhow, they found that by providing that before a dive, it actually reduced bubble formation. So it's conditioning the lining of the blood vessels, maybe making it more difficult for these little micronuclei to adhere to the sides, and therefore not creating an environment where you've got a lot of seeds for bubble formation. So there's, like I said, there's still a lot of work in there.
Andrea, you are up.
Okay. My question has to deal with going to a higher temperature at the end of a dive or after a dive. Is it a good idea to sit in the jacuzzi on the Spectre at the end of a dive day, or does that potentially cause problems, or is it beneficial?
So there are a lot of people who say, don't take a hot shower because it's going to reduce the solubility of gas in your tissues.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. There have been cases where people have gone taking a very hot shower, and ended up with decompression sickness. Now, when you're talking about jacuzzi, you're talking about what? I don't know what temperature, 100, maybe 100, 100.
104.
What's that?
104.
Yeah, but something that's not that much higher above body temperature. And so if we've got gas dissolved in our body at body temperature, we're talking maybe 7 degrees. And when we're talking solubility and temperature, we're dealing with an absolute scale. So in terms of Fahrenheit, switching to Rankine, and I forget the conversion there, but it's a very, very small percent temperature change. Same with if there's any bubbles in the body, yes, increasing temperature will cause that bubble to grow. But again, it is relative to absolute temperature. So we always, at the end of our day of diving in the quarry in Ohio, came back to my parents' sauna. Now, granted, we're dealing with like 40, 50-foot dives. Not, it helped get the body warmed up. So I don't see a problem. Me personally, I don't see a problem sitting in 100, 104 degree temperature water. Where I do see the problem is if you start getting under very hot showers and basically exposing a certain area of the body with that heat, that could potentially cause gas to come out of solution. So it's not a yes, you should, no, you shouldn't. It's this, like a lot of things, this area of gray.
And Andrea, I would add something that your specific example, the hot tub on the Spectre, I would say the biggest problem is if you are not a passenger on the Spectre and you are swimming over from another boat and saying, excuse me, I'm going to use your hot tub because Karl said it was okay. I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
I agree. Yes.
I just want to be on record so we're clear about it.
Okay.
And then I will go ahead and ask Tabby what he's heard over the years, because I've heard multiple things.
If you guys don't know Tabby Stone, Tabby was the president of Pacific Chapter UHMS. He's a physician. He knows a lot of shit about diving. Tabby, would you like to answer Karl's question?
Basically the same thing as Karl said. I mean, I've heard various things over the years, and there's nothing that's been consistent about it.
Thank you.
Well, that was a succinct answer.
Yeah.
All right. Anyone else got any looking over at the rogues gallery here? Any other questions? Laura, you're just sitting there with not your hand raised, your hand on your chins. That's okay. Well, I think we've exhausted the questions then. So the point too with all this is there's a lot of stuff to think about, a lot of stuff to know, and sort of part of the takeaway here, I hope that you will get from Karl's talk is just because you're looking at the computer and it says, 13 minutes, there's a lot more that goes into it than just that. And as the old joke goes, there's two ways to guarantee that you never get bent. Number one, don't dive, or number two, if you dive, don't come up. Beyond that, we're taking a chance. So you take all these factors in and as best you can, and make the best decisions you can, because as Karl sort of said, there's a second computer you're taking with you, and it's up there, and it knows a lot more about what's going on in your body than your actual dive computer does. So Karl, thank you very much. Once again, we give a great Zoom Seekers thank you for your talk. Remind you guys, our talk next month is on my sister's birthday. It is October 10th, and it'll be Dr. Charlotte. Well, she was Dr. Charlotte Sadler last month. I don't know if she's going to take her husband's name or not. I'm thinking she's probably gonna keep Sadler for at least for a while. But she's a doctor down at UCSD, and she's been involved with a lot of the diving specific COVID studies, and she's just going to update us on what we know or don't know about COVID and diving, and especially given that we had CDC approval today, I think, of the new COVID vaccine. I believe that would be an interesting talk. So make a note for Tuesday, October 10th. Again, thank you, Karl, for chatting. And as we close this out, I'll tell you guys, I want to thank you all for joining us here for another edition of Zoom Seekers. and it's nothing personal, but the only way for me to get out of this call is to hit the end button, and that's end meeting for all. So thank you very much, and we will look forward to seeing everybody in October.